Hi everyone, so welcome back to this channel. So in this video, we will be learning about important Spring Boot annotations, and this will be part 1 of the important Spring Boot annotations video. So in my previous video where we created CRUD based Spring Boot application, we used a few annotations that we have not yet discussed about on this channel. So let's just quickly jump right in. So we will learn about important Spring Boot annotations. We will learn how to use them. We will learn why do we use them. And we will also go through the practical aspects of using those annotations in my Spring Tool Suite application. Okay, so let's get started. So what are Spring Boot annotations? First, let's get to know that quickly and then we will jump into the specific annotations. So Spring Boot annotations are a form of metadata that provides data about a program that is not a part of the program itself. They do not have any direct effect on the operation of the code that they are annotated on. And these annotations, they do not use XML. Instead, these annotations use the convention over configuration principle. So whole Spring Boot, it is based on the principle of convention over configuration. So these annotations are used to achieve the convention over configuration principle. We do not have to do lots of configurations. We just use these annotations and we are good to go. So now coming to the first annotation to discuss, which is the @Spring Boot application. So this is the main annotation to use in any Spring Boot application. Let's discuss this. So the entry point of any Spring Boot application is the class which contains @Spring Boot application annotation. So whichever class in my project, in my application has been annotated with @Spring Boot application, that class is the entry point of my Spring Boot application. And also necessarily this class, the class annotated with @Spring Boot application, should have the main method to run the Spring Boot application. So there should be a main method defined in that class, the class that is marked with this Spring Boot application annotation. And if I have added this @Spring Boot application annotation to the class, we do not need to add these annotations which are enable auto configuration, component scan, and @Spring Boot configuration explicitly. So my Spring Boot application annotation, it is combination of these three annotations: the enable auto configuration annotation, the component scan annotation, and the Spring Boot configuration annotation. So whenever in my Spring Boot application I have used the @Spring Boot application annotation, I do not need to mention these three annotations explicitly. The Spring Boot application annotation comes as a package of these annotations, and hence we do not define these annotations separately. Okay, so let's look into all these three annotations. So talking about @enable auto configuration annotation. So this is the annotation that brings the auto configuration feature of Spring Boot. So let's discuss this. The Spring Boot auto configuration feature tries to automatically configure my Spring application based upon the jar dependencies that I have added in the class path. Like for example, I have an application in which I have added the h2 dependency. So then we do not need to configure any database manually. Spring Boot will automatically configure an in-memory database for me. How does it do that? Using the @enable auto configuration annotation. So behind the scenes, this annotation, it automatically configures my Spring Boot application based on the jar dependencies that I have added in the class path. So I hope that's clear. Whatever dependencies that I have added in my class path, Spring Boot will automatically configure my Spring application based on those dependencies. And by default, this auto configuration feature is not enabled. We have to manually enable this by using either @enable auto configuration annotation, or we can also use @Spring Boot application annotation. And in most of the cases, we will see that we are using @Spring Boot application annotation itself and not the enable auto configuration annotation. Okay, so coming to the next, we have the @component scan, and this is one of the most important annotations in Spring, which is used along with the configuration annotation which we will talk about next. And this component scan annotation is used to specify the packages that we want to be scanned. By default, the component scan annotation, it scans for components in the current package and all of its sub packages. So this is the default behavior of this component scan annotation. It will scan for components in the current package and the sub packages, unless and until we do specify additional packages to scan. And this component scan annotation, it enables component scanning. The Java classes that are decorated with stereotype annotations such as @component, @configuration, or @service are auto detected by Spring when we have this component scan annotation enabled. So let's suppose if I have an application, and in that application I'm making use of a controller class, a service class, a component class, let's say. So how does my Spring Boot identifies that, okay, this class is a service class? So first I have to use specific annotations for those classes. Like if I have a service class in which I have defined some business functionality to implement, so I will use @service annotation in that class. Spring Boot will identify that, okay, this class is a service class using this component scan annotation. So it scans for the components in my application, this @component scan annotation. Okay, so let's go into the next annotation, which is the third annotation included in the Spring Boot application annotation, which is @Spring Boot configuration. And this annotation, it annotates the application class. This indicates my Spring container that the class has @bean definition methods, which we can also say that my class has methods that do instantiate and configure my dependencies. And this Spring Boot configuration annotation is used mostly through the Spring Boot application annotation itself. If in my application I have already specified the @Spring Boot application annotation, so I do not need to specify the Spring Boot configuration annotation separately. The Spring Boot application annotation itself takes care of this Spring Boot configuration annotation. So with this, we come to an end of the discussion of our Spring Boot application annotation. We have seen that it is a combination of these three annotations: enable auto configuration, component scan, and Spring Boot configuration annotation. And we have also discussed these three annotations specifically. So let's move to the next annotation, which is @REST controller. So this REST controller, it was introduced since Spring 4.0. Before that, we had @controller annotation only. What is this @REST controller annotation? So if I have already have @controller annotation, why do I need to use this @REST controller? So let's see that. So this @REST controller, it is a specialized version of the controller annotation, and it does nothing but adds both annotations, which are @controller and @response body annotations. Okay, so the REST controller annotation is mainly used for building RESTful web services using Spring MVC. It is a convenience annotation, and it packages two annotations, which are @response body and @controller annotation. The class that has been annotated with @REST controller, it returns JSON response in all the methods, and we do not have to specify @response body on each and every methods that I have defined in my controller class. I just need to specify @REST controller on the class level, and everything is being taken care of. Okay, so this was it for @REST controller annotation. So whenever we are creating controller classes in my Spring Boot application, instead of using the @controller annotation and then specifying @response body individually on each and every handler method, we can specify this @REST controller annotation on my controller class itself. Okay, so now let's look into a practical aspect, like where do we use REST controller annotation. So I'll move to my Spring Tool Suite application, where we can see the practical implementation of this REST controller annotation. So here I have a simple Spring Boot application, and this is my controller class, the name of consumer controller. And here we can see that on the class level, we have used the annotation @rest controller. So whenever I am creating controllers, it is mandatory to annotate that class with @rest controller. So I hope that was clear for this rest controller annotation. Now let's move into the next annotation, which is @request mapping. So this request mapping, it is one of the most widely used Spring MVC annotation, and this annotation is used to map web requests onto specific handler classes or handler methods. So this request mapping annotation, it is both a class level annotation and a method level annotation. And whatever web requests that are coming as part of my incoming request, this annotation is used to map those requests to specific classes and to specific methods inside those controller classes. So this request mapping annotation, it can be applied to the controller class as well as methods. So let's see that in practicals. So I have come to my Spring Tool suite once more. Here we can see that my controller class, on the class level, I have used this request mapping annotation and specified that any request which is appended with /my consumer details has to be mapped to this controller, to my consumer controller. So let's suppose if I have a request /my consumer details /save consumer. So in that case, based on the /my consumer details, the request will be mapped to this class first. So that is the use of the @request mapping annotation. And we can use @request mapping on both the class level and on the method level. So on my method level, I have used this @post mapping annotation, and then I have specified the URL /save consumer. So any web request that has /my consumer details and after that /save consumer will be mapped to this specific method inside my controller. So that is what the use of request mapping annotation is. Okay, so now let's talk about this request body annotation. So this request body annotation, it indicates that a method parameter should be bound to the body of the web request. This annotation is used to bind the HTTP request body with a domain object in the method parameter. Okay, so I will quickly explain that with the help of a demo. So here I have a post mapping method with the name of save consumer, and in here I have used request body annotation and I'm passing the consumer object here. So what will happen whenever I'm trying to hit this /save consumer method? Let me quickly jump to my postman. So whenever I'm hitting this method localhost 8080 /save consumer, in my body I have to specify the details of this consumer object that I'm passing in the request body parameters. So here I'm passing the JSON object of the consumer, and this request body parameter, it deserializes this JSON based object into a Java based object. So that is the purpose of request body annotation. Whatever details, whatever parameter, whatever object that I am passing in the body of this method, save consumer method, whenever I'm trying to hit that URL, so the Spring framework, it will automatically deserialize this JSON object into a Java based object. And by default, the type we annotate with request body annotation must correspond to the JSON that is sent from our client side controller. Does that specify? Here in my save consumer, I'm passing this 4 parameters. So that has to match with the attributes of the type that I'm specifying here. Like I have specified the consumer, go inside this class, and this class, it contains few fields like name, address, plan, etc. So these fields have to match with the attributes that I'm passing here in the body of this method. So that is a pre-mandate condition whenever we are using @request body annotation. So let's jump on to the next annotation, which is @path variable. So this annotation, it is used to extract the value of the template variables and assign their value to a method variable. So there are only two fields in this annotation. We have the name and we have the required. Name it denotes the name of a request URI template variable or a path variable. We need to use it when the name of a path variable and the name of its respective method argument are different. And required, it denotes if the request URI path variable is mandatory or not, and all the fields that are marked with @path variable annotation are by default mandatory. If I have to make it optional, I can do that using the syntax @path variable, and inside brackets we have to specify required is equal to false. Okay, so let's see how this path variable annotation looks in the practical aspect. So here I have a get mapping method, and what I'm trying to do here is based on the ID, I'm trying to return the details of a consumer. I have used the path variable annotation, and inside the brackets I have specified template variable I have to pick from the request URL, and where do I have to map into. So this /id, it denotes template variable I have to pick, and this long ID, it specifies that I have to assign it to this ID. And once I have assigned the variable from the request URL to this ID parameter, I can do whatever I need to do as per the requirement. Here in the mapping, I have used /getConsumer/ID inside parenthesis. So whenever I hit the URL like localhost 8080/getConsumer/001, so in those cases that 001 will be mapped to this ID, and based on this path variable annotation, the 001 will be assigned to this variable long ID that I have specified. So that is the use of the path variable annotation, and we can specify this to be optional using @path variable, and inside brackets required is equal to false. Now talking about some more REST annotations that we use in Spring Boot application. So we have the get mapping annotation, we have the post mapping annotation. So talking about get mapping annotation, this is used for mapping HTTP GET requests onto specific handler methods. So whenever I have to use a get method in my Spring Boot application, I can use this @get mapping annotation. And earlier we used to specify that this is a get mapping method using this whole syntax @request mapping value is equal to /get/id, and then method is equal to request method dot get. But since the introduction of this get mapping, we can just specify @get mapping and then specify the URL. Then my Spring Boot framework, it will know automatically that okay, this is get mapping method, and the value of URL that we have to use is /get/id. So that is about get mapping. Now coming about post mapping, @post mapping annotation. It is used for mapping HTTP post requests onto specific handler methods, and this specified that this handler method will be acting as a post method. Specifically, post mapping is a composed annotation that acts as a shortcut for @request mapping method is equal to request method dot post. So if I go to my Spring Tool Suite application, so here I have a post mapping method, and we have used @post mapping annotation and then specified the URL /save consumer. And alternatively, this can also be done using the request mapping value /save consumer, and then specify which kind of method is this dot post. So instead of whole of this syntax, which is also doing the same thing as this simple post mapping use. So we do not have to specify which type of method and the request mapping annotation explicitly. We just use @post mapping annotation and specify the URL. That's it. So it is a more convenient for the developers to use this post mapping and get mapping annotations instead of whole writing the request mapping and specifying the method that we are using. Similarly, we have for the get mapping annotation, just use the @get mapping, specify the URL that you want to map to this method to, and create your method. Now talking about put mapping, this annotation is used for mapping HTTP put requests onto specific handler methods. So earlier we talked about post and get mapping. Now, if I want to implement a put method, so in that case, I can use @put mapping annotation. And similarly, if I want to implement a delete method in my application, I can do that using @delete mapping. Okay, so we are done with @get mapping, @post mapping, @put mapping, and @delete mapping. Now let's talk about this @service annotation. So in my Spring Boot application, if I have a Spring Boot application, where do I write the business functionality? Where do I implement the business functionality? In Spring Boot applications, we do implement our business logic inside our service layer, and our service layer, it does make use of this @service annotation. So this service annotation, it is nothing but a specialization of @component annotation. And this Spring service annotation, it can only be applied to classes, so it is only a class level annotation, and it is used to mark the class as a service provider. This Spring service annotation is used with classes that provide some business functionalities, and whenever I have used a service class and I have annotated that class with @service annotation, Spring context will auto detect these classes whenever annotation based configuration and class path scanning is used. So in short, we do implement our business logic inside service classes, and those classes have to be annotated with @service annotation. Now coming to my Spring Tool suite, inside my this demo of consumer Spring Boot application, so I have this class in which I have implemented the business logic. Like whenever I have to save a consumer, I will create an object of consumer repository, and in there I will use this save method defined in my repository and pass this consumer object. So this is what my Spring Boot application is doing. So I have implemented the business logic in this class, and I used @service annotation in here, which will mark this class as a service class, and during component scanning, this class will be marked as a service class. Now let's talk about a few JPA annotations, a few important JPA annotations you use whenever you are creating JPA based Spring Boot application. So talking about the first annotation, we have the @entity annotation. So this is a class level annotation, and this entity annotation, it is used to specify that this class is an entity. Now, whenever we are creating a JPA based Spring Boot application, let's suppose I have an employee object that I'm trying to persist in my database. I will save the details of that employee object. I will fetch the details of an employee object. So my employee object will be the Pojo class that I'm trying to persist in the database. So whenever I have a similar requirement, I will mark this employee Java class with @entity annotation. And an important point to note, whenever I used @entity annotation, in whichever Pojo class I'm using @entity annotation, it is always mandatory to have a no-args constructor and a primary key defined for the class. So whenever I have used a Pojo class that I wish to persist in the database, I have to first mark the class as @entity. Second, I have to use a no-args constructor, and also third, I have to define a primary key for that class. Now, if I come to my Spring Tool suite, here I have used this consumer class as the Pojo, and in this consumer class, the attributes of this class I'm trying to save in the database, I'm trying to persist in the database. So here on the class level, I have used the @entity annotation, which is coming from the package jakarta.persistence.entity. And this entity annotation, it specified that the class is an entity. And we also have to create a no-args constructor whenever we are using @entity annotation. And also I have to mark any field as the primary key whenever I'm trying to save the object of this consumer class in my database. This attribute will act as the primary key, and for that I also have to use this @id annotation, which we will talk in a few minutes. So I hope this entity annotation was clear. Now coming to the next annotation, we have @id annotation. So each JPA entity, whenever we are creating a JPA entity, it must have a primary key that uniquely identifies it. The @id annotation, it defines the primary key, and we can generate the identifiers in different ways, which are specified by generated value annotation. So if I come to my application here, I have a private long ID field, and this class I have specified that this will be acting as the primary key for this consumer entity that I'm using. And I have to mark this ID object with @ID annotation. And I can also specify the strategy for generating the values of this ID field. So using this @generated value annotation, I can specify the strategy for generating the values of this ID field. We have a few different strategies, like we have the auto, we have the table, we have the sequence, or we have the identity. Now coming to the table annotation. So in most cases, the name of the table in the database and the name of the entity won't be the same. So coming to my application, here I have used this Pojo class with the name of consumer, and I wish to save this object with the name of consumers as my database table. So in that case, I can use this @table, and inside brackets, we can specify the table name by which name we want to save this object into my database table. So here I have used name is equal to consumers. So my table will be created with the name of consumers, and we can see that my entity class is marked as consumer, and for the database name I'm using consumers. So whenever we have a mismatch, we can use this @table annotation. And similarly, we also have an annotation like @column annotation, and this is used to mention the details of a column in the table. So let me just quickly implement the use of column annotation. So suppose I have this private string name, and inside my database I have to make a column with the name of consumer name. So how can I do that? You can do that using column annotation from the Jakarta.persistence API, and inside brackets I will specify the name of the column to map this particular field to. So I want to map this name to my column name consumer table. So in that case, I can do that using @column annotation. Inside brackets, I have to specify the name of my column name. So we are done with the JPA annotations. Now let's quickly discuss a few more annotations, which are @bean and @repository. So @bean annotation, it is a method level annotation. And in Spring, we used to specify this @bean annotation using XML bean tag. So what this bean annotation does, it tells the method to produce a bean that will be managed by my Spring container. So whenever I have to use a method that must be managed by my Spring container, I need to annotate that method with @bean annotation. So talking about @repository annotation, this is a class level annotation, and the repository is a data access object that is used to access the database directly. So whenever I'm creating a repository that will do all the operations related to the database, I do have to mark that class with @repository interface. Okay, so with that, I think we come to an end of this discussion. We learned few annotations. We learned about few annotations that are used in Spring Boot. So this was a part 1 of the important annotations in Spring Boot. We'll soon be publishing the part 2 of the Spring Boot annotations, where we will be discussing more complex annotations that are used in Spring Boot. So this was an introduction to the annotations in Spring Boot tutorial. I hope I was clear, and that was it for this tutorial. I will see you in the next one. Thank you.